Korea's long and troubled history is largely defined by its geographic position between larger powers. The struggle to find a balance between Japan and China repeatedly facilitated a tug-of-war that enabled internal division and invited foreign intervention in the Korean Peninsula. I'm your host Shirvan and welcome to Caspian Report. The earliest evidence of an organized government in the Korean Peninsula dates to 700 BC. The kingdom of Kojoseon, as it was known, emerged north of the Han River and had its capital at what is now Pyongyang. Like most domains in East Asia, Kojoseon was heavily influenced by the Chinese and Manchurian culture. Somewhere by 400 BC, a second realm, known as the State of Yin, was established in the south of the peninsula. There remain too few artifacts to tell the whole story, but the border between the southern state of Yin and the northern kingdom of Kojoseon was strikingly similar to the present demilitarized zone by the 38 parallel north. The point in question is that much like the geopolitics of today, the peninsula was a contested area. For instance, the dominion of Kojoseon was conquered by a Chinese kingdom, only to break away a century later, before returning to the Han Dynasty in China. This back-and-forth conflict eventually turned Kojoseon into a Chinese client state. Ancient burial sites in Pyongyang are filled with Chinese goods, such as silk and jewelry, which illustrate that the North Korean kingdom was a commercial hub with a lively culture that was closely connected with ancient China. By comparison, tombs in the South Korean kingdom are filled with locally produced goods instead of Chinese. This subtle difference implies that the ancient societies in the north and south of the Korean peninsula were as deeply divided as today. In the 2nd century AD, the Han Dynasty in China collapsed and the court in Pyongyang managed to break away and reinvent itself as the kingdom of Goguryeo. The newly established kingdom had to face off against the neighboring Chinese and nomadic warlords. From this experience, the Goguryeo society developed a martial culture of their own. They constructed fortresses across the realm, mastered horsemanship and archery, and at the peak of their power, they even managed to expand into Chinese territory by conquering most of the Manchuria region as well as the remainder of the Korean peninsula. For having defied the odds against a numerically superior opponent, the Goguryeo kingdom is viewed with great pride in the modern Korean societies. However, in the 5th century, a new kingdom called Yamato had unified the Japanese islands and established commercial ties with China. As a hub between the Japanese and Chinese realms, the domains in the south of the Korean peninsula benefited greatly from the regional trade. In fact, the southern realms of Shilla, Baekje, and Kaya grew so wealthy that they rebelled against Pyongyang's rule and formed their own independent kingdoms. In Korean history, this stage is known as the period of the Three Kingdoms, and the era presents many similarities to the current situation in the peninsula. The southern kingdoms imported many foreign ideas from mainland Asia. For instance, Buddhism and Confucianism were the prevailing beliefs, while the local scripts were based on Chinese characters. One of the newly formed southern kingdoms, Shilla, conquered its smaller neighbor Kaya. Soon afterwards, Shilla secured an alliance with the Tang Dynasty in China and conquered the southwestern kingdom of Baekje, which had its capital by what is now known as Seoul. Shilla's power had surged so rapidly that it overthrew the kingdom of Goguryeo completely in the 7th century. By unifying the peninsula under one state, Shilla had reached its peak of power. In the 8th and 9th centuries, it would enjoy a golden age. Yet, by inviting foreign participants in Korean conflicts, such as the alliance with the Tang Dynasty in China, a dangerous precedent was set. Then, as now, geopolitics was a delicate business. If Shilla could exploit its central position wisely, it could hold the balance of power between Japan and China. On the other hand, if it lost control, it might be crushed between these two powers, and that is precisely what happened in the early 10th century. An internal conflict among the Korean nobility broke the stalemate and divided the kingdom of Shilla into numerous local groups. One of those factions, led by Wang Kong, established an understanding with the Japanese rulers. This alliance shifted the balance of power, and Wang Kong conquered all of the Shilla territories and established the Koryo Kingdom. The modern name Korea is an abbreviation of the ancient Koryo Dynasty, which emerged as a prosperous state with a sophisticated culture. Much like their predecessors, the rulers of Koryo sought to emulate the political system of the Song dynasty in China by recruiting Chinese monks, merchants, sentries, etc. However, unlike the previous kingdoms, Koryo constructed its capital, Kaesong, by the mouth of the Han River. By relocating its court to the center of the country, Koryo sought to strengthen the bond between the societies in the north and south. The arrangement worked so well that in the following century, Koryo enjoyed a cultural surge. Many modern Korean cultural features are rooted in this era, including clothing, cuisine, music, ceramics, and many other crafts. It was also an era of innovation. Korean scholars experimented with gunpowder weapons, and the inventor Cho Wang-yi constructed the world's first printing press with movable parts 200 years before Gutenberg's press in Europe. Yet, despite these achievements, the rulers of Koryo soon encountered the same difficulties that the preceding dynasties had to deal with. By the 11th century, a new fight among the nobility plunged the kingdom into a political crisis. Military and civil court officials sought the favor of the supreme ruler, and in the ensuing domestic rivalry, the military officials orchestrated a coup against the civil administration and gained the de facto control of the state. This ordeal severely weakened the grip of the ruling monarchs. By the 13th century, Kublai Khan of the Mongols had crushed, plundered, and conquered China. To add insult to injury, he proclaimed himself the Emperor of China and established the Yuan dynasty. In 1271, the Mongols also subjugated Koryo, and for the next century, the Koreans once again paid tribute to their larger neighbor, as they had done so during the Han dynasty a millennium earlier. However, following the takeover of the East Asian mainland, the Mongols shifted their attention to the Japanese archipelago. Since the Korean Peninsula was the shortest route to Japan, the Mongols forced the rulers of Koryo to construct warships and provide supplies for the Mongol invasion of Japan. Although this campaign ultimately failed, for Japanese rulers it was a moment of clarity, as they came to see the Korean Peninsula as a fundamental security risk. In the mid-14th century, the Yuan dynasty fell apart, and Koryo broke free. Yet, in doing so, its coastline was immediately exposed to raids by Japanese pirates. At the same time, the new Ming dynasty in China mobilized its armies and sought to reclaim its control over the peninsula. Sensing that an invasion was imminent, the Korean military commanders prepared to meet their Chinese counterparts on the battlefield. As the Korean expedition crossed the Yalu River by the Chinese border, a general named Seong-gye refused the call to war and turned his armies south towards the capital, where he deposed the king and seized power for himself. The general established the Chosun Dynasty in 1392 and moved his court to modern-day Seoul. To reassure the Ming dynasty, the kingdom of Chosun maintained close ties with China. The most esteemed Joseon monarch was Seisho the Great, who reigned over the peninsula in the 15th century. As a patron of art and science, he promoted the research of astronomy, medicine, music, economics, etc. Yet his most celebrated achievement was the creation of the Korean alphabet. In essence, the cultural advances during the Chosun dynasty played an indispensable part in the formation of the Korean identity. This age of prosperity broke down in 1592, when the powerful military ruler Toyotomi Hideyoshi centralized power and conquered all the other domains in the Japanese archipelago. Up to this point, warlords in Japan had been preoccupied with each other. They had perfected the art of war, applied the latest innovations, and fielded hundreds of thousands of veteran warriors. With Hideyoshi's rise to power, all these components came under his command. Emboldened by his sheer strength, Hideyoshi sought to subjugate China. However, to do so, he had to conquer the Korean Peninsula first. These circumstances sparked the Japanese invasions of Korea. Over the next few years, Japanese troops fought against Korean and Chinese forces for the supremacy of the peninsula. In the early phase of the conflict, the Japanese contingents, who were better trained and equipped, had nearly conquered the entire peninsula. Yet eventually, the Koreans turned the tables when Admiral Lee Sun-shin mobilized his acclaimed turtle ships and defeated the Japanese fleet. Admiral Yi recognized that even though the Japanese had superior land forces, the Koreans, however, had a superior navy due to their battle-hardened experience with pirates. The admiral used this to his advantage and decisively defeated his Japanese counterparts in every fight. In his most acclaimed battle, Admiral Yi, with only 12 ships, defeated a Japanese armada of 330 ships without losing a single vessel. By securing the seas, the Korean admiral had severely immobilized the Japanese forces and detached them from their supply chain. Hideyoshi's forces were left with no choice but to retreat. For his military prowess, Lee Sun-shin is credited as one of the greatest naval commanders in history. But the Japanese invasions had inflicted excessive damage on the land. Towns had been pillaged and people had been enslaved or massacred. By the end of the hostility, roughly 250,000 people had perished. It was the most destructive conflict in East Asia up to World War II. Following the death of Hideyoshi in 1598, the succeeding Japanese rulers abandoned the designs for Korea and China, and in the following decades, all three states ceased their contentious attitudes and focused inwards. Yet the regional truce was once again disrupted when the warrior Jurchen tribes in Manchuria unified into a strong coalition and launched sporadic raids into China. As such, in the early 17th century, with the Chinese Ming dynasty still in disarray from the Japanese assault, the balance of power shifted in favor of the Jurchen coalition, who eventually replaced the former and ruled over China as the Qing dynasty. At the same time, the Chosun Dynasty in Korea became a de facto dependency of the new overlords in China. This provoked the Japanese to renew their belligerent stance on the mainland of Asia, but the balance of power was left as it is. Following this violent chapter in history, the Korean Peninsula experienced an unusual era of peace, unity, and prosperity. In the next 2 centuries, the Kingdom of Chosun extensively reformed its organization for civil administration, taxation, education, agriculture, etc. These reforms greatly boosted the state revenues, yet this era of rejuvenation ended abruptly with the arrival of Western powers in the 19th century. The interaction between the West and East set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately overthrow the geopolitical affairs in the Korean Peninsula. Now, if you're interested in learning more, check out our report on the origins of the Korean conflict for the modern history of Korea and how the nation was split into North and South. I've been your host Shivan from Caspian Report. Credit goes to our contributors on Patreon for giving us the means to research and produce original content like this. If you want to learn more or gain access to some perks like early access, PDF reports, etc., consider joining our community on patreon.com/CaspianReport. All the funds help to keep our channel independent and self-sustained. In any case, thank you for your time and Sarol.